This is Lamar White Jr. of the Bayou Brief, and I'm proud to introduce the debut of our podcast, Briefly Speaking. Briefly Speaking is brought to you by the reader-contributors of the Bayou Brief, Louisiana's first and only statewide political news and culture publication. You can find us at www.bayoubrief.com and donate to the site by clicking the blue button at the top of the page that says Back the Brief. Today, I'm honored to be joined by three of former President Obama's top aides and the co-founders of what has quickly become one of the nation's absolute digital media best outlets, Crooked Media, and the host of, I think, the best political podcast, Pod Save America, which is also an HBO show of the same name. They will be in New Orleans on February 8th at the Orpheum Theater, along with a very special guest they have not yet announced. It may be difficult to distinguish between who is who, so let me provide you a little background on the guys. John Lovett is originally from New York, but received his college degree in mathematics from Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. To friends of the pod, as they are known, it may come as no surprise that Lovett worked as a stand-up comedian. He previously also worked as a speechwriter for then-Senator Hillary Clinton, beginning in 2005 and throughout her 2008 campaign for the Democratic nomination for president. He then worked as a speechwriter for President Barack Obama for 3 years, and afterwards embarked on a career in California as a screenwriter and producer. John later revealed that he secretly officiated the very first same-sex marriage ceremony in the White House, well before the president had officially endorsed marriage equality. Most listeners are likely familiar with his partner, who, no offense to anyone else, is probably the hardest-working journalist in the country, Ronan Farrow. Tommy Vietor is a Massachusetts native and graduated with a degree in philosophy from Kenyon College in Ohio. Now, according to his Wikipedia, he's a descendant of Ethan Allen, the Revolutionary War hero who basically founded the state of Vermont, not the furniture company. In 2004, instead of taking a job with John Kerry, he decided to work for a relatively unknown state senator from Illinois, who was setting his sights on a seat in the United States Senate. He worked for Senator Obama, then presidential candidate Obama, as Iowa press secretary. If you recall what happened in Iowa in 2008, then you'll agree. This was a BFD. During the Obama administration, he served as deputy press secretary for 2 years and then as national security spokesman and a special assistant to the president for the next 2 years. That's special assistant to the president, not special assistant president. Tommy is also the host and creator of another podcast, Pod Save the World. And last but not least, Jon Favreau, another Massachusetts native, the valedictorian of his college class at the College of the Holy Cross, and one of probably the most well-known members of the Obama administration, serving as his chief speechwriter when Obama was a United States senator, a candidate, and of course as president. This is true. He was 23 when he first met Obama backstage at the DNC and helped the then state senator with a couple of edits on a speech that immediately catapulted Obama into a global political phenomenon. Favs, as he is known by his friends, or Fav, as the president called him, went on to help Obama craft some of the most memorable speeches in modern American history, including his 2009 inaugural address. We are pleased to have them on our very first debut episode of Briefly Speaking. And I just wanted people to know we're thrilled to be joined by three of the most well-known podcast personalities in America. All three of whom worked for the last president of the United States to win the popular vote. Since then, you guys have used your podcasts, particularly Pod Save America, to speak truth to power while thriving in political exile. So you're kind of like the Dalai Lama, and the podcast is kind of like the Ramson. Thanks for joining me, John, Tommy, and John. And thanks. I also wanted to thank James Carville and y'all's friend David Axelrod for helping to set this up. I'm not sure how much you know about my background or what information you're given, but the Bayou Brief is the only statewide nonprofit news and culture publication in Louisiana. And now that you're, I guess, on your way to Charleston for a show at the Orpheum on Friday the 8th, I'm not sure if tickets are still available, but if they are, I would recommend going. I've a few questions for you, but the most obvious question, there's one obvious question, and I'm warning you that the wrong answer to this question could result in a boycott of your show. The question is, were the Saints robbed?
This is Tommy. Yes, love it has a longer answer. Look, I don't know if you follow the news, but people from Hollywood get away with touching people against their will all the time. And yes. That's just something that's happening out there. And it's unfortunately that it's also now hit the Saints. Oh, did someone write that joke for you? No, that is my I wrote about sports myself, and that may also cost me my job.
It works. I don't think it's going to piss off too many people. But the city is sort of reeling still. Even a week later, I think it'll be a psychic wound for a long time, and really probably don't really blame the players or the Rams as much as we blame Roger Goodell.
Goodell sucks. I mean, you're talking to two New England Patriots fans. Yeah, Roger Goodell is a $45 million per year doofus. He has no business having that job. And that was the worst non-call I've ever seen in the history of football. So,
cool. That's all right. Your show's gonna be sold out. No worries.
Perfect.
So look, we don't just cover Louisiana news. Occasionally, we cover stories occurring next door in Texas and in Mississippi. I'm actually the guy who posted the videos of Cindy Hyde-Smith talking about public hangings and voter suppression. I don't know if you remember that. You probably do. It's kind of crazy.
Oh, yeah.
And unfortunately, it didn't really seem to matter too much in the end, but I don't really want to get into that. I want to ask you about our neighbors in Texas, because a month before the election last year, my brother and I were backstage at a concert in Dallas with Spoon and the Polyphonic Spree. But the real rock star of that show was Beto O'Rourke. And while we were backstage, and I was actually speaking with Beto, there was a camera crew from Crooked Media that was filming was filming him as a part of a documentary. They've been filming for, I guess, a year. So today, Cory Booker entered the race. What do you think Beto should do? And do you think that he can sort of trap lightning in a bottle twice?
Yeah, I mean, Tommy went to high school with this guy, David Mitigliani, who's the filmmaker for this project with Beto, and David came to us 2 years ago, a year ago. It was before anyone knew who Beto O'Rourke was, and we barely knew who he was.
Right.
And he said, "There's this amazing Senate candidate who really could knock off Ted Cruz, and I'm going to do a documentary, and would you guys be willing to help out and co-produce in this effort?" And he said, "Sure." We took a chance on it, and he became this big thing. Look, we've said here that Beto should run because I think he has a unique ability to sort of inspire kind of grassroots activism we saw in Texas.
Yeah.
I do think he has to make up his mind as he looks at the field, as he looks at all the candidates in there. Like, do I have something to add? Do I have something to add that no one else does? And is this the right moment? Do I want to be president? Is this the right moment for me to run for president?
Right.
And we say this about every single candidate. You really have to look at the field, think about the moment, and figure out what do I add to this race that no one else can bring. And I'm imagining he's going through that process now. Our goal in
yeah, go ahead.
Our goal in the primary generally is we would like to talk with all the candidates and be neutral as a show and an organization, because we think it's important that there is a big, vigorous primary to really sort out the key issues and vet candidates in advance. But Beto would obviously contribute a lot to that process.
And
I'll say too, it actually hasn't been that hard to be neutral, because we have a lot of really great candidates who have announced so far, and who may announce, soon. So I'm excited to sort of see everyone up on stage at these debates, see how the campaigns go, and try to figure out who's the best nominee from there.
I just, I before I even knew that you guys, or the Crooked Media at least, was producing a documentary, I mean, just the stuff that he did on Facebook Live, I remember actually wrote on social media that Beto himself was producing perhaps the best political documentary of all time. I mean, just the Facebook Live stuff was really extraordinary, and people were tuning in, hundreds of thousands of people to watch him order Whataburger. I mean, it's just, I just kind of wonder if he can replicate that authenticity, because it seemed like there was, it was truly unforced, right? It wasn't like him. It wasn't like he wasn't scripted to drink a beer or something. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, I think there are obviously too many layers between voters and candidates, and there have been for a while. And so, for a lot of people, politics seems distant because there's like slickly produced ads and sound bites and applause lines and all the other bullshit that you see from campaigns. And I think the more the candidate you can sort of break down those barriers between you and voters and just communicate directly with people like you would if you were just sitting with them at a bar or a restaurant, the better off you're going to be candidate. And I think that's not just a lesson for Beto, but that's for everyone who's running. And I think you see a lot of candidates doing that.
So, okay, let me move on to Louisiana, because 2019 is an election year here in Louisiana, and it's critically important for us because we're one of the only states in the South with a Democratic governor, and because the majority of our Republican state officials are truly awful, like Chris Kodak awful. States like Louisiana are often written off by national Democratic candidates, as well as the DCCC and the DSCC during federal election years. But, when you see what Beto nearly pulled off in Texas, it makes many of us, in fact, there were phone banks for Beto here in New Orleans. It makes many of us here think that maybe Democrats continue to lose in the Deep South because we've been held hostage by the mythology of the blue dog Democrat. Is it time, do you think, to bring the blue dog to the veterinarian and finally put him down?
I don't know that I'm willing to go with you on the journey of that analogy, but I think this is a question not just about what's happening in the South. I think it's one of the bigger questions Democrats are grappling with. I've seen a few people put it this way, which is like, do you win the center by moving to the left? There's a lot of questions people have about what actually appeals to the kind of voters that Democrats haven't been winning in a long time. But I think if you look at what you've seen like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, somebody ran a boldly progressive race geared around expanding healthcare and working class issues, and she did better than anyone thought she would, and she put Georgia on the table. You saw Andrew Gillum in Florida mount an incredibly positive campaign with a unabashedly progressive vision. I think you saw the same thing with Beto O'Rourke.
Yep.
And I think you're starting to see that the Democratic primaries now, with people making this case for a different kind of politics, that you don't compete against Republicans by being more Republican. You compete against Republicans by offering a better vision that appeals to everybody. That appeals to working people of every color. So I think that's very exciting. I think it's an important debate. I think one other facet of this is that there's no easy answers, and it's not going to be simple. And each state is different and has a different electorate, and will affect different things of voters. And one thing we talked about after the 2018 midterms is that you could look at that outcome and you could draw any conclusion you want. You could look at from Joe Manchin to Arizona to House races across the country, and depending on where you were, some people ran on a more kind of bipartisan message, others ran on a more boldly progressive message. I think it's one of the hardest questions for Democrats, but you see a lot of different versions working.
Yeah, and just to your point, I mean, you see what happened with Doug Jones, right, in Alabama, and that's a lot of folks say it's attributable to African American women who turned out en masse, right? And the South we've got the highest proportion of African American voters in the country. 32.2% in Louisiana. I think it's a little higher in Mississippi. It just seems though that the Democratic Party has done, or at least not the party in general, but here in Louisiana, we've done a bad job recruiting candidates. There has not been a single African American elected to statewide office in Louisiana since Reconstruction. So, I'm just we kind of struggle with this issue, which is how do you break through because 32% of the state's African American, 97% of those African Americans are registered to vote as Democrats. They just don't turn out to vote, So,
I think the formula for like statewide success in the South. I mean, I remember, we were looking at like David Plouffe back in '08 saying, years down the road, Georgia's going to be competitive, and it's going to be competitive if both two things happen. One, we organize and make sure that African American turnout is much higher than it has been. And certainly in the primaries, at least in '08, Obama won most of the southern states because African American turnout has been higher than it had ever been. And two, and you saw this in 2018, like around cities in the South, around in Atlanta, the suburbs of Atlanta, we saw in Georgia, like college-educated white voters for the first time are starting to tilt more towards Democrats. And so if you combine college-educated white voters in the South with higher African American turnout, you can pick up, you can make a lot of these states more competitive than they have been.
Right. I totally agree, and I think that the old theory, I guess, was that people in Louisiana and throughout the Deep South were registered Democrats, but they weren't really Democrats because of what happened in the '60s, right? And the reorientation of the parties, right? But I think that that's probably no longer true. I think that the math still adds up. The math today is the correct math. We're about 40% registered Democrat in Louisiana, 26% independent. I wanted to ask y'all about jungle primaries. In case you know, you probably are familiar with jungle primaries, where you sort of a unique state. We have jungle primaries. Anybody and everybody who wants to run can run all at once. Doesn't matter what your party affiliation is. So it was initially, these were conceived by Edwin Edwards in the early 1970s. He thought for sure that this would basically cement Democratic control of the state, and it ended up having the exact opposite, decimated Democratic control. Are you a fan of open primaries or jungle primaries, call them? And if so, why? If not, why not?
I think open primaries and jungle primaries, I think open primaries is a better case to be made. Jungle primaries, to me, I think introduces too many unintended consequences. Yeah. I mean, we should, you shouldn't lose sight of what the goal of these primaries are. It is for groups of people who are part of a coalition to come together and choose the person they want to represent their values. I think a jungle primary can do that, but too often, as you describe, you see moments where there are all kinds of unintended consequences of the way the math worked out. Democrats can be shut out. Ironically, we face this. We face this in California. Luckily, it didn't happen. There was a chance that, ironically, so much Democratic enthusiasm and so many people getting in the race because they believed so strongly in the need for change would have shut out Democrats and put Republicans in a position to keep seats. And what the voting populace of that district was saying unequivocally is that they wanted a different option. So, to me, I think there were a lot of very, at least certainly in California, which I know about more. There were, I think, pretty at least honorable intentions behind these jungle primaries. We gotta have a better name for them. Terrible name for them.
Yeah.
I guess ranked choice, whatever.
That's a different issue. I was going to ask you what you think about ranked choice.
Yeah. So anyway, that's what I think about the jungle primaries. I think that there's just too much risk that don't reflect the will of the people.
Oh, here in Louisiana, the jungle primaries are held the same day as the midterms or the presidential election. which means that if there's a runoff, it occurs the next month, as you guys know. And that's why we've seen very little, I think that's one of the reasons we've seen little enthusiasm or investment from national PACs, the D-TRIP and the DSCC, because by the time our runoffs occur, we basically have an idea of who's in control of Congress or the White House, right?
Right.
So,
yeah. I mean, I think that I am very open to different, better ways to conduct elections. In my book, that should start with a national holiday for voting, just as many ways as possible to make it easier for people to vote. Because I think, when you start asking people to vote in a runoff, you're likely to get even lower turnout numbers. And with the jungle primaries, you can see instances where people can exploit the system and have someone run to split the vote and all kinds of mucking around. Great.
We saw it last year in our Secretary of State's race. And we also hear, I hear, I don't know if you've ever heard people say this, but I hear this all the time. Folks who are told, hey, I've already voted for you. What do you mean I have to vote for you again? In a runoff election, that is. So, it affects that as well. Okay, so there's another one more Louisiana. Well, actually, really two more Louisiana questions, but I think the most existential crisis facing Louisiana, and I think most people would agree with me, is the coastal land loss that we've experienced due to climate change and the oil and gas industry. In fact, the very first climate refugees, as they were called, during the Obama administration, in the entire country, they were from Terrebonne Parish. Terrebonne Parish also happens to be an epicenter of big oil. We have this conflicted sort of abusive relationship with the oil and gas industry, right? But yet, like Louisianans, the polling data shows Louisianans really care about the environment. One of our slogans is that we're a sportsman's paradise. The industry spent a huge fortune on counter messaging any groups or any attempt to hold these guys accountable. So look, Carville once said that we need a slogan like "Don't mess with Texas" to make it clear to folks what is at stake. This is, I'm spitballing here. You're all political messaging experts, speechwriters. I hate to put you on the spot here, but do you have any ideas about what sort of message could reach people about, the urgency of this crisis? I mean, we're losing a football field of land every 48 minutes here.
I don't have any slogan in my back pocket, unfortunately.
That would be awesome. I mean,
if we could skip off a phone call and come up with a message that would address one of the thorniest and most difficult political and social and cultural problems of the last, say, half century,
right.
Would be awesome. But I don't know that would happen. Look, I would say, though, that I have been impressed by people talking about the Green New Deal. Partly because I think the messaging and the politics around that is very smart, because the oil companies and the oil industry are going to spend, a boatload of money all the time to try to make their case, right? And they're going to, but I think what people are really worried about to the extent that they're worried about, moving to a renewable energy economy is obviously jobs, right? Like, what's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to my livelihood? And I think by talking about the Green New Deal, it emphasizes jobs in the economy and basically sets out this idea that we're not going to, stop climate change independently of making sure that everyone has a good paying job. And, in some of the Green New Deal plans, you see the government saying we're going to have like a federal job guarantee with a livable minimum wage, for people who have to transition out of dirty energy industries, right? And so I do think if we are going to have a national effort to combat climate change, it has to be paired with, economic justice for people who may feel the effects of this transition.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess right now the issue is that these companies were, not to get too much into the weeds, but these oil and gas companies, they violated their permits. They dredged canals illegally to make it easier for them to move, offshore oil inshore. And in so doing, they destroyed, they've admitted to this, but they're refusing to pay any of the damages, and it's been ongoing. In fact, the first case may be headed to trial in the next 3 months or so. That's another reason why this year's election is so crucial, because we see that Republican candidates are universally opposed to these lawsuits, which could net the state somewhere like $38 to $50 billion. So okay, I've kept you guys for about 20 minutes, and
it is incredibly unpopular when you really focus in on what these oil and dirty fossil fuels are doing to the economy and the environment. Really, like when you poll should polluters pay for their pollution so that we can have clean air and clean water and renewable energy jobs, that polls extremely well.
Yep.
And I do think continuing to talk about these companies being allowed to do whatever they want to our air, to our water, to our coastlines, and that we should be able to regulate that. We should do so in a way that provides and creates the jobs of the future, right? That to me is sort of the best case for combating climate change.
I've actually seen a poll. I don't know if it was ever publicly released, but here in Louisiana, that polled all of our the 7 media markets, right? And where the areas in which it was most popular to go after oil and gas companies are the very areas where these companies are located. So it didn't poll as every area polled over 50%, but along the coast it was 75%. And the further inland you went, the less support it had, which is somewhat ironic to me. These people are less affected,
Yeah, I know.
Anyway,
well, that's it's like immigration views in the center of the country too, right?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It's a really good analogy. In fact, we have a guy running for governor of Louisiana who's a multimillionaire running against John Bel Edwards, Republican, and he's running on the border wall. On building the wall, which of course has nothing to do with
the coast of Louisiana.
Yeah.
The way to think about it is the further you get from the coast, the less it becomes a local issue, and more for people it becomes a national issue. Yeah. Because one thing we've seen over and over again is, despite the evidence for climate change and the need for environmental action getting stronger, the polarization around the issue has also gotten stronger. We also, Louisiana, like everywhere else, is contending with a giant corporate and media propaganda apparatus that makes it very, very hard to persuade people.
Yeah, and completely can outfund anybody on the opposite side of the aisle. So I've got just one more. It's really a multi-part thing, and I just wanted to give you some quotes from. I want to see if you could guess who said some of these things, because I know during the 2008 Democratic primary, Hillary Clinton famously said that you campaign in poetry but you govern in prose. I'm not sure if that's exactly right. I'm curious actually if you think that's right. It sounds nice, but in and of itself is kind of a poetic statement. So look, we're known for having pretty famous poetic politicians here. I want to give you guys a few quotes from some famous Louisiana politicians. And I want to see if you can guess. I don't know how familiar you are with. You probably are familiar with some of these guys. If you could guess who said what, and which quote would be your favorite. I think probably the most popular one is, "The only way I'll lose this election is if I'm caught in bed with a dead girl or a live boy." You have any idea?
I know the quote. And I would be learning from you that it's attributed to one person and not just sort of a.
It's a really interesting story too, actually. It's Edwin Edwards, and the person that got the quote is Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, right? When he was a reporter for the Times-Picayune. And his editor, this is the story I've been told, his editor cut the quote out of his story. And then he was like, no, we have to add this back in. And it became this, legendary quote, right?
It sounds strange, but it is exciting to know that we've made so much progress that now the boy would have to be dead too.
All right, so the next one is, this is probably a little more obscure. It's, don't write anything you can phone, don't phone anything you can talk, don't talk anything you can whisper, don't whisper anything you can smile, don't smile anything you can nod, don't nod anything you can wink.
Kind of like that.
I know, I do too.
Who's that?
That would be Earl K. Long. If you've not read the book, in fact, I'll try to send it to you because I have copies that I send to folks. The Earl of Louisiana. It's a really fantastic book, written by a guy from New York who came down in 1959 when Earl Long famously was committed to a mental institution while he was governor. And then he escaped from the mental institution by firing the head of, he was governor. He fired the head of the, Department of Hospitals. And it's sort of just this legend. He's Huey P. Long's brother. So I kind of like this one. I'll just tell you, I'm not sure if this was a slip of the tongue, but this is another quote, and it's by Huey Long. And it's, the time has come for all good men to rise above principle.
That's a great Huey Long quote. Huey Long. He has some good ones. He's a great Trumpian figure.
Yeah. Yes. The original Louisiana populist. Some people still think that the state is divided between what they call them Longites and anti-Longites. That's like the original bifurcation of our state's politics, at least in the 20th through 21st century. I'm not sure if I buy that anymore, but we haven't had a real populist governor since Edwin Edwards. This one should be, I think, fairly easy. This quote is, we must insist on assimilation. Immigration without assimilation is an invasion. We need to tell folks who want to come here, they need to come here legally. They need to learn English, adopt our values, roll up their sleeves, and get to work. Get any idea? I'm going to give you another hint on this one. This is the guy who's also against hyphenated Americans. He's hyphenated Americans. If he's that obscure, it makes me feel better. Because he did run for president.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, is it Bobby Jindal?
Yes, Bobby Jindal. Yeah, Bobby Jindal. It's just a strange quote. I've always thought it's a strange quote because he's the son, of course, of immigrants from India, and then converted to Catholicism at the age of 18, and I don't know if anyone would ever want to write a book about the guy, but I just think he's a fascinating character. I've noticed that some quotes that historically are attributable to Louisiana politicians get distorted or get sort of stolen and paraphrased by other people. So you may have heard this one before, but it's, if you want to hide something from Jack Grimion, and Jack Grimion was the Attorney General, if you want to hide something from Jack Grimion, put it in a law book. Have you guys ever heard a quote like that, or?
Oh, don't hit on that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also Earl K. Long. I will send you guys the book because, what this guy for A.J. Liebling wrote it from the New Yorker, and his assignment, I'm going to paraphrase James Carville here, his assignment was to come down to Louisiana and learn about our insane governor. And when he came back to New York, he realized the governor was the only sane person in the entire state. The last one is, I'm David Duke, just without the baggage.
Is that Steve Scalise?
Steve Scalise.
Was it?
Yes, it was Steve Scalise, yeah.
Nice work, Tommy. Yeah,
Yeah.
brutal. Really cool quote.
Yeah, yeah.
Vidder quote. Yeah. What's the Vidder quote? Like, pass the diaper?
God. Pass the diaper to the left-hand side. I don't know if there's a really good Vidder quote. Unfortunately, he's making a ton of money right now. I'm not sure if you've been following that, but he's now a lobbyist at Mercury, and he's working for some Russian oligarch.
Yeah. Good for him.
Good for him. There are a fascinating number of connections between this investigation and Louisiana politicos and political consultants, and it's like we're second only to New York. But look, I'm really excited about you guys coming down here. I hope that we get a chance to actually meet in person. I will be sitting, I guess, like on the third or fourth row. I don't know where they have me. But you probably won't be able
to. We'd love to say hi, and we're excited to get down there. Yeah.
Yeah. I understand you guys have been down here before, right? So familiar to you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys were with President Obama when he came down.
I did not go on that trip.
You did not go on that trip?
Oh no, I remember that trip, but I didn't go.
It was really, really cool. He came to, I think it was the 5th anniversary of Katrina, which would have been 2010, and he made a surprise. Yeah, he gave a speech, and he surprised people by pulling up to the Parkway Bakery and Tavern, which is this, like, it was, went underwater during the storm, and I live here now, but I happened to be visiting at the time, and it's these young African American kids just started running down the street screaming to all their neighbors, "The president's here, the president's here, the president's here," and within 10 minutes, the whole neighborhood showed up. It was kind of cool. It was the president and his whole family, and yeah, it was a neat place for him to have chosen to go have lunch. Yeah, I'd recommend it to you guys too because they make a mean po' boy.
That's good. I'm excited to get there and have a po' boy.
Yeah.
All right, Lamar. Well, thank you for chatting.
Look, thanks, guys. Thanks so much for listening to the very first episode of Briefly Speaking by the Bayou Brief. This is Lamar White. I want to especially thank John Lovett, John Favreau, and Tommy Veeder for allowing me to talk politics and Louisiana history with them. And they will be here in New Orleans, Louisiana on February the 8th. They are en route. Their first stop is in Charleston, South Carolina later this week, but if you do not already have tickets to their show in New Orleans, I recommend snagging them up as soon as possible. I'm sure their very special guest will be special, and we are already lining up our next guest for our next episode, who will also be very special. So until then, I hope that you continue to read the Bayou Brief. That's www.bayoubrief.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Lamar White Jr. That's JR. Or follow the Bayou Brief at Bayou Brief. Until then, I'm signing off.